this is usually one of our favorite programs that we run when we do a father-son mishmar, always really right before Pesach. And usually we get to see all the fathers. We have a guest speaker who comes and joins us. Obviously, as everyone knows, not just are we online, but in the COVID environment that we have right now, it makes it incredibly complicated in the context of inviting people and doing things in person. But there's an added benefit, and that is that we're able to host someone who would never necessarily be in Toronto at this time and who's able to join us from afar. And it really is my privilege to welcome Rabbi Daniel Rapp. I'll open by one introductory Dvar Torah, and then we'll jump right in. The Torah, very, very beginning this week's parsha, says, Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav, me'ohel moed le'mor. And I'm not much of a Hasidic speaker, as you know, but there's a beautiful vort from Noam Elimelech. Noam Elimelech, or Elimelech Weisblum of Lizhinsk, is what he's usually referred to, one of the great founding Hasidic Rebbes in the founding movement, a student and a close Talmud of the Maggid of Mezrich. He says the following, he says, it doesn't make sense. Why does the Torah start without telling us who's doing the calling? The caller of Moshe is not revealed until the second half of the pasuk. He says, Vayikra el Moshe, and then Vayidaber Hashem elav, me'ohel moed le'mor. First of all, he says, where's the caller? Why doesn't it say Vayikra Hashem el Moshe? Only the second half of the pasuk. And then why the small aleph? What's the message that's being sent in the context of this? And the Noam Elimelech answer is fascinating. He says that the aleph is the key to the answer. He says the aleph is small because it's making a statement that the Shekhinah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, is often small. God's name is not mentioned because until an individual responds to God's call, it's as if he's not there at all. It's as if he, Moshe, isn't even necessarily called in the first place if Moshe doesn't answer the call. Famous comment, parable, idea that if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, doesn't make a sound at all. So the Noam Elimelech would say in the context of that, for Moshe, for Kadosh Baruch Hu, the answer is no. Because if God calls and no one responds, he hasn't in effect called at all. Now, the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is associated with Vayikra, and it's not unless someone answers the call. And unless we respond, there's no speech. And the same, I think, in many ways is true for us. And it's why we do these programs often before Chagim. The Rambam writes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has not stopped talking to people. It's just that we've, to some extent, stopped listening. We've lost the ability to hear. But if we want to hear, we have to feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's usually around the Chagim, where we gather together in shul, the Pesach Seder, we get ready, we prepare. Those are the times when we can bring ourselves closest to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and those are the times where it's most apropos to prepare with extra learning beforehand, extra divrei Torah. And it's with that sort of brief introduction that I introduce Rabbi Daniel Rapp, who's a good friend of mine from many, many years ago, from my days in Yeshiva University, also happens to be the cousin of our very own Mr. Hillel Rapp, and has close connections to Rabbi Noam Horovitz and Rabbi Turchiner and many others among our team here at Yeshivat Or Chaim. He teaches currently in the Irving Stone Beit Midrash program and the Mezuzah Yeshiva program at Yeshiva University, and he's also the rabbi of the East Denver Orthodox Synagogue. Talent to be able to accomplish both of those. He received his BA cum laude from Yeshiva College and his doctorate from Columbia University School of Law, where he is twice named a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar for Academic Excellence, and was an articles editor of Columbia Business Law Review. Mr. Rabbi Rapp, in addition, spent 2.5 years studying at Kerem B'Yavne in Israel and was ordained, received his smicha at REITs at YU, receiving Yadin. He's currently also a dayan, a judge at the Beis Din of America, and he is a lecturer par excellence who is able to combine humor with incredible knowledge to the pleasure of all who listen to him. Rabbi Rapp, it is a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's nice to almost be in Toronto. Hopefully maybe one day we can physically make our way over there. Opening question, do you want to give the people some time to prepare the sources, or should we just jump right in?
No. We'd love to give everyone a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes to sort of learn themselves. What if you framed it, I would say, for 5 minutes, give everyone 1 or 2 questions to focus on, 1 or 2 questions to look at. Then we'll give everyone about 10 minutes to look at 1 or 2 key sources, and then we'll jump in, and Mr. Lazar is going to share the source sheet with everybody right now. Does that work?
Absolutely. So just give me a minute, and I'll give a brief overview of what you're looking at. So and oftentimes,
just Mr. Lazar just shared it in the chat, the document. Everyone can click on it so you have it yourselves. Rabbi Rapp, please.
Okay. So we have traditions in Judaism, right? Obviously, there are things that we do because it appears in the Chumash. Certain things we do because they appear in the Gemara. And then there are other things we just do because we have a tradition. If one generation passes down to another generation, a certain tradition, right? The way our Sefer Torah is written, every letter, right? It's a pass down. We write our Sefer Torah the way we do is because the old ones look that way, etc. And there is a chain that goes back. We have an interesting question, which comes up surprisingly from time to time, is what happens if new knowledge goes against the tradition? What if there's archaeological evidence? What if there is some other sort of scientific evidence which tells us that we've been doing something one way and it probably isn't right? An example that people might be thinking of, it's not exactly the same as the idea of tcheles, right? For many, many years, nobody wore the blue strings. All of a sudden, some people get together and they decide we're going to do research, and they believe that even though our tradition tells us there is no tcheles, we think we can put it back together. One of the cases where we have this actually is in Maror on Pesach. So I gave you some sources. They're all in English or translated into English. Why don't we take 10 minutes, look it over, and we'll get back together at 8:20? Does that work, Rabbi? So as you read, so let's start with the discussion of Maror. Maror, we all know, are bitter herbs. The question is, what exactly is the plant that we call maror? The Gemara tells us, actually the Mishnah already tells us, that there are 5 different types of vegetables which can be used as maror. The first one's called chazeres, the second one is called tamcha, the third one's called charchavina, then there's ulshin and maror. The problem is that none of these words are very easy to translate. What exactly is charchavina? The problem is that we do not use the word in modern Hebrew. There is no connection whatsoever. Therefore, the Gemara turns around and tries to tell us what it means. But the problem is the Gemara translates the words into Aramaic. Now, some of it works. Chazeres is translated as chasa. Chasa happens to be a modern Hebrew word. What does chasa mean? No, Yeshiva Bnei Akiva, we should know.
Lettuce.
Well, that's lettuce, correct. We believe that chazeres is lettuce. In fact, if you look at Rashi, Rashi gives the Old French, which happens to be the Latin also, letuga. Letuga is also a Spanish word. That's why the number one we refer to as romaine lettuce, that's chazeres. Ulshin, the Gemara tells us, is hindavi. Hindavi, we assume, are endives. The third one is tamcha. What is tamcha? So the Gemara is not very helpful here. Gemara tells us that tamcha is translated as tamcha. Great, that was very helpful. Thank you very much. I'm glad I paid for the Gemara that I was able to get that. What does this mean? So we have a tradition. In fact, among the Ashkenazi Jews, tamcha is the oldest tradition we have. Rashi quotes that tamcha is what we call horseradish. And because we refer to, and based on that Rashi, the minhag of most Ashkenazi families throughout the generations has been to use horseradish. Now, there's a problem with that tradition. Now, again, Sfaradim tend to use romaine lettuce. Things might have changed over the last few years, but Ashkenazim use horseradish because that's our tradition. We are following Rashi that tells us that tamcha, that's what it means. The problem becomes, okay, let's say that's right. Let's say that's what it is, but I'm sure everyone has eaten horseradish. For starters, horseradish is not bitter. It's sharp. The next problem we have is that the maror is described as a leafy vegetable that has sap. The maror that we eat is not a leafy vegetable, it's a root. So the question is, what do you do with this? On the one hand, we have a tradition. On the other hand, the tradition does not really match up well with what we are told maror is supposed to be. That's why I give you the first piece here from the Rav Soloveitchik, where Rav Soloveitchik was a big fan of the Masorah. Whatever the tradition is, it is, and that's all what matters. Famously, when the Radziner Rebbe decided that he wanted to bring back Tcheles, and he came up with his idea that it's the cuttlefish, he sent out these questions to all the Rabbanim of the time. Among the people that got it was Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, not the Rav, but his great-grandfather that he was named after. And Rav Soloveitchik said, you may be right, I may be crazy. On the other hand, he says at the end of the day is that he says, even if you're right, you're wrong, because we rely only on tradition. Our tradition is that we lost the Tcheles. And therefore, even if you can show me scientifically that you found it, it's not. I'm sorry. And therefore, the Rav says, as we see in this piece, he says, what is maror? Right? He says, I have a Masorah that maror is horseradish. The Chacham, he said, Svarim say maror is lettuce. Fine. But according to Rav Soloveitchik, Masorah, the tradition overrides everything else. There's nothing to talk about. Now, what that means is you can bring all the proofs in the world that this is wrong, but if this is how my father did it and his father did it and his father did it, I don't care. So the maror that I'm using doesn't match up? Not my problem. This is one of the rare cases where Rav Shechter disagrees with his Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik. And it's based on the Gemara that you hopefully got a chance to see. I'll quickly run through it outside, if those of you who might have missed the point. There's a famous blot or two in Bava Basra about Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana tells these wild stories. Anybody's interested, there's a wonderful book written by the Rosh Yeshiva of Bnei Yisrael called The Juggler and the King, where he goes and he explains these various agaritas through the eyes of the Grub. A wonderful, wonderful read. Very deep, on the other hand, not very hard to read. And in the story, Rabbi Bar Chana tells that all of a sudden he took this magical mystery tour. That he came up and he met an Arab in the desert, and the Arab said to him, I'll take you on a tour you won't believe. So he took him to the place where the ground swallowed Korach and his followers. He took him to see the place of Har Sinai. And he also took him to see where the Mesei Midbar were. The people who died in the 40 years in the desert. And that's the Gemara that we have here. And he explains miraculous how large these people were. And he decided, you know what? I'm going to take one of their tzitzis with me. One of the corners of their clothing. Why did he want to do that? Well, there's a we all know that on our tzitzis, there's 4 strings that are doubled over. That's the opinion of Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai, however, was of the opinion that it's 3 strings doubled over. And he wanted to bring back and say, look, at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, this is what the tzitzis looked like. Here it is, archaeological proof, undisputable proof that this is what Hashem said. So he took one of the tzitzis and he's going to bring it back and he can't move. He's stuck. And he says, what's going on? And the tour guide says, did anybody take something that you weren't supposed to? He said, I did. He said, put it back. And he puts it back and they were going to go. He gets back to the base measure. He said, you're not going to believe where I was today. We had a school trip, best school trip ever. We went to see the Mesei Midbar. And then afterwards we went for pizza. It was unbelievable. It was a tremendous trip. They said to him, well, what did you do? He tells them the tzitzis. He said, well, you don't got to bring us the tzitzis. Just tell us, how many strings were there? He said, I forgot to count. You forgot to count? What a fool. How could you forget to count? That's the Gemara. Rav Schachter reads this, leaving out the fact that it's quite a fantastic story. Rav Schachter points out that, wait a second, let's say he would have brought back the tzitzis, and there were 3 strings doubled over. Or let's say he would have come back and given testimony. I counted, they have tzitzis like Beis Shammai. What does anyone think? Would they have done something about it? Feel free to pipe up now. Fathers, make your sons proud, or vice versa. Sons, make your fathers feel like they're getting their money's worth out of your education. No, what do you say? Let's say he would have come back and he said, here, you're all wearing Beis Hillel tzitzis. I got a Beis Shammai string. That's what they were doing at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu.
They can change.
What?
They can change.
They can change. It sounds like right, because 100% in the event that they wouldn't agree to that, why were they making fun of him that he didn't bring it back?
Lo b'shamayim here.
It's not b'shamayim. What's b'shamayim? It's ba'aretz. Right? He dug it up. This is what it was. We're having a machlokas. Does it look like this? Does it look like that? Here, I've got one. Game, set, match. So Rav Schachter says, you see from this story that even though we have a tradition going back thousands of years now, that our tzitzis look a certain way, if science would show us archaeologically that we're wrong, we would change. That the Masorah fills in the gap when we don't know the facts. But if we would find out the facts, everything would change. That's why Rav Schachter disagrees with Rav Soloveitchik. According to Rav Soloveitchik, this is all silly. Why was he bothering? According to Rav, why did they make fun of him? And so why did you just count? But they didn't care. So therefore, Rav Schachter says no, that we follow science. We follow archaeology in this case, rather than following the tradition that we've passed like Beis Hillel. Rav Chaim Kanievsky reads the Gemara totally differently. Rav Chaim Kanievsky says, well, what's going on here? For starters, why can't he move once he pulls the string? Isn't that strange? All of a sudden, we're playing freeze tag and no one's going anywhere until we give back the tzitzis? Why does Hashem do that? And not only that, you don't have to be a Rabbi Bar Chana to figure out to count the strings. Right? This isn't rocket science. Right? I'm sure most people can figure out, and what if it's like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai? Let's give a count. Right? Wouldn't that work? So why does Hashem intervene twice? One, he stops him from bringing it back. Second, he makes him make a ridiculous mistake and not to count it. He said, clearly the Gemara is telling us that Hashem does not want us to take archaeological proof and use it in the place of Masorah. Rav Chaim Kanievsky reads the Gemara the exact opposite way of Rav Schachter. Rav Schachter steps in and says, listen, I in fact have an idea. I think the Gemara is telling us clearly that in the event he would have brought it back, they would have listened to him, and therefore science can replace tradition. So too here. Now this idea that Rav Schachter has comes up in a few interesting places. So we all have a tradition that in order we make the bracha mizonos on the 5 grains. What are the 5 grains? So chita, saora, shibola, shuel. Right? We have a list of what they are. And the Gemara says, what about rice? Right? My wife is gluten-free. She has rice flour all the time. So why isn't that like wheat, etc.? So the Gemara tells us because when you add water to wheat flour, it ferments, it rises. It's what's called chimutz, right? That's where the word chametz comes from. that something rises. In the event that you add water to rice flour, it has a chemical reaction, but less of a chemical reaction. It's not chimutz, but it's sirchon. So what do we see? We see that in order for something to be a mezonos, it has to have a chemical reaction, which is greater than rice. There was a professor at Hebrew University, Professor Yehuda Felix, did some wonderful work, but among the things he did is he ran a study. Is he took different flours, he added water, and then he measured the chemical reaction. And of course, flour, wheat flour, barley flour had a much greater reaction than rice. But oat flour, rye flour, and spelt flour had less of a reaction than rice. And based on that, Professor Felix said we had misidentified 3 of the 5 grains. And in fact, he showed that there were 3 other grains which grew in the Middle East that in fact do have more of a chemical reaction. And based on that, Professor Felix suggested that you should stop making a mezonos on your Cheerios, because your Cheerios are made out of oats, and oats are not one of the 5 grains he has proven scientifically. And therefore, it should probably be ha'adama, shahakol. Rav Shechter thought that Professor Felix was right. And therefore, Rav Shechter would not eat his Cheerios alone and make a mezonos on it. When he ate his Cheerios for breakfast, it was part of a well-balanced breakfast, which included toast. Orange juice, I imagine, as well. This is the idea. Yes, everybody knows that oats are one of the 5 grains. But Rav Shechter said that you could step in, you could change it. Yeah, we've been saying for hundreds of years that horseradish is Maror. Rav Shechter says no. Look at the botany behind it. It's a root. It's not a leaf. There's no sap in it. It's not actually bitter. It's sharp. Rashi had a tradition. That's very nice, but it's not right. That's Rav Shechter's approach. And of course, Rav Soloveitchik disagreed with this. Now, it's interesting that this discussion goes back a pretty far way. I gave you on the source sheets a Ramban al HaTorah. This Ramban appears in the Ramban al HaTorah. It's not actually on a pasuk, but he writes a very interesting story. We know the story of the Ramban. The Ramban at some point in his life moves to Israel. When he gets to Israel, he finds an ancient coin. And he takes this coin, he can't read it because it's written in Ksav Ivri, in ancient Hebrew, right? The Hebrew that we read now in the Torah is Ashuri. It changed that way in the time of Ezra. But before that, there was a different type of script that he was not familiar with. However, the Samaritans continued to use the script for years and years afterwards. So he goes and he says, he took the coin to a Samaritan and he said, "Can you read this to me?" And he said, "Sure." You know what it says on it? It says on it, Machsis HaShekel. 50 agorot, it's a half a shekel. That's what he tells him. He says, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And he explains on one side of the picture, there is a picture of the mon. On the other side is a picture of Aaron HaKohen's staff. And it says on it a half a shekel kodesh. Now there's a machlokes among the Rishonim as to how much a half shekel weighs. How much silver is that? So the Ramban says, I took it, I weighed it, and I'm right. I always thought a half shekel was this size. Other people disagreed with me. The game's over. I've got a half shekel. I've got a golden ticket, and now there's nothing. You can't stop me. So the Ramban clearly thought that did it. That's one case. There's another famous case brought by the Smag. The Smag tells an unbelievable story that they used to be identified, they could identify the grave of Yecheskel Hanavi. And at one point, there was some sort of covering on Yecheskel's grave, and it collapsed. And what did they find when it collapsed? Sheamus. What do you put into graves? In it, they found a pair of tefillin. They opened up these ancient tefillin, right? These tefillin have got to go back a long way. They predate Yecheskel Hanavi. And they went to check, are these like Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam? Right? Because the difference between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam is the order that the parshios are put in. And he opened it up and he says, look, they're like Rashi. You see from there that Rashi is the correct tradition, and therefore Rabbeinu Tam is incorrect. So you have two cases here where Rishonim point to archaeological evidence in order to answer up a machlokas. There's a tradition one way or the other way. That's what you do. You think this is a good proof? Everybody likes it? Anybody has any complaints? So I can tell you that a lot of the Svarim have complaints. The Drisha, for example, in Hilchos Tefillin, quotes this smag, and he says, you know, that's all very nice, but what were these tefillin doing in Shemus? Do we put kosher tefillin into Shemus? Not so much. Maybe the reason they were in Shemus is because they put the parshas out of order. Maybe Rabbeinu Tam is right. All the people busy high-fiving yourselves now, you could have spoken up beforehand and taken credit instead of sitting back now and saying, yeah, I knew it. So to say that that's a proof, that's one issue. Regarding
Wait,
the
but if you knew they were wrong,
what?
if they knew they were wrong, they
Ah.
could have fixed them. Why would they put them in Shemus?
Because you can't fix them, actually. The
Oh.
tefillin have to be written kisidron. So if there's, for example, a mistake in your Sefer Torah, we know, you can just fix it. If there's a mistake in tefillin or in mezuzah, everything has to be written in order. So Parsha A has to be before, one has to be between two, before 3, before 4. If there's a problem in Parsha number 2, let's say, 3 and 4 are no longer usable. Everything beyond that. So again, if this was written, if the guy wrote 1, 2, 4, 3, then he's got a problem. 1 and 2 is savable, but half of it's useless. So that is the question on that. Regarding the Ramban, the Abarbanel comments on this and the Tashbates comment on this, and they both say, you know, it's not great for a few reasons. Right? One reason is, who are you relying on? Right? He was relying basically on a tzeduki. Right? The person who's giving testimony that this is actually a shekel is somebody who rejects the entirety. So how much are we going to believe the person? That's A. B, the machokas basically is a half shekel, 10 grams or 12 grams. He says, you see from here, it's 10 grams. We know over time, coins get handled and they lose some of their weight. They get smoothed out. So he says the fact that at this point it matches the lower number doesn't mean that originally it didn't match the higher number. Now, what's interesting from all these points is that everybody seems to be saying that, yeah, theoretically, we would accept your proof, but we have concerns about it. We have concerns about the science. Yes, you found it there, but what does that mean it was kosher, right? It's the same story we have with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll never change anything based on the Dead Sea Scrolls because the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't your standard Orthodox Torah observant Jews. So therefore, that seems to be the issue. If you want to rely on archaeology to change a Masorah, you've got to be very, very sure that it's correct. I also threw in another famous case. If anyone's ever been to the Israel Museum, they famously there have the Aleppo Codex, the Keter Aram Sova, which is the oldest, most exact copy of Tanakh that we have. And if you open a Sefer Torah anywhere in the world, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, it should be exactly letter for letter the same. However, Teimanim have one letter different than the Ashkenazim and Sephardim. In Parshas Ki Tetzei, in the word Petzua Daka, the word Daka, they spell with an aleph instead of a hey. The Keter Aram Sova matches the Teimanim against our Sifrei Torah. So it would seem that would be another case, that if somebody really, really was convinced. Now, again, that the Keter Aram Sova goes back a mere 1,200 years. So one could argue that, that might not be enough for us to buy in. But according to Rabbi Shechter, there is definitely a possibility. Now, interesting, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was asked about whether or not one can rely on Professor Felix and to stop making him a zonos. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said no. Rav Shlomo Auerbach says it's very nice. I'm not saying he's a wonderful Jew. What he does is l'shem shemayim, but the Masorah always wins. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach follows Rav Shechter, Rav Soloveitchik, not like Rav Shechter. And based on that, he says we always follow. Now, what's interesting, I'll just end with this note, is that after Professor Felix came out with his study, and Rav Shechter stopped making a mizonos on his Cheerios, later studies disproved the study of Professor Felix. And I believe Rav Shechter now has gone back to making a mizonos on his Cheerios. So I think with the story of the Drisha and the Abarbanel, etc., is that even if you would to follow Rav Shechter, and even if you would accept the idea, which I think is not a crazy idea at all, that scientific evidence could undo a Masorah, one has to be exceedingly careful to be sure that the scientific evidence is not just a theory, but actually a fact. 8:45 is the time when it ends, so I will thank everyone very much. If anyone has any questions, I'm available. But either way, everyone should have a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. All the best.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Rabbi
you.
Rapp. Any questions? I want you to know, Rabbi Rapp, Professor Rabbi Felix was actually the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Or Chaim, founding Rosh Yeshiva of Bnei Akiva Schools. So perhaps you knew that, perhaps not, but
Nope. I did not know that.
Connection as well. Any questions? Jeffrey Brown, go for
Yes,
it.
good evening, everybody. You started out with Rabbi Soloveitchik, and so there's without getting into the details of a question, is a chazaka because of Masorah?
Well, I would ask the question that I think is the Masorah because of the chazaka, right? There's a concept of chazaka that has nothing to do with Masorah, right? A chazaka that if a woman gives birth, it probably came from her husband. That has nothing to do with Masorah. That's a concept of chazaka.
Okay.
Yes, right? The question, it might be the other way around, is a Masorah because it's a chazaka? Is that the question? Because that's the case, the answer probably is at least partially, but this is probably more than a chazaka, right? A Masorah, we believe, is like one step beyond a chazaka, right? Chazakas come and go. Masorahs, we assume, are very hard to extract.
Is a chazaka not immutable?
Chazaka is mutable. Masorah, not as much. According to again, Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Soloveitchik, not at all. According to Rav Shechter, it is, but it takes a lot to move it, more than to move a regular chazaka, I would think.
And
To be continued.
Rabbi Rapp,
Thank you.
the
Yes.
difference between Masorah versus Minhag. Can you spend 2 minutes on that?
Isn't the minhag a Masorah? How can you have a different minhag than your Masorah, right? A minhag is what your father did, is like your Masorah is what your father did. How can your father be doing two different things? I assume that it's a case that doesn't come up.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Jonathan Strauss.
What about halachic opinions that you know are based on erroneous science, like Zmanim of Rabbeinu Tam, which is based on like an incorrect kind of understanding of science?
I would not, listen, I don't follow Rabbeinu Tamzman, but I would not say it's based on an incorrect science, right? Rabbeinu Tamzman is based on the idea of you're not looking at sunset, but you're looking at the point where the rays of the sun no longer can peek over the horizon, right? And the question is, that's very hard to figure out what type of declension, shall we say, of the sun over the horizon. Again, it's not really scientifically right because the sun's not declining, it's the earth that's moving, right? That's more of an art than a science. But there are cases where you come into this, right? I don't know if that's a case, but I mean, the most famous case is the case of killing lice on Shabbos, right? Right. The assumption, it sounds from the Gemara, it says that the lice spontaneously reproduce, and we believe that that's not true, right? So that's the question. There's really three different approaches to it. Some people will say, okay, that's the end of that. Some people will say, we'll never bend. And then there's a third in between opinion that Rabbi Dessler has. It's a longer discussion than this, but we'd be happy to discuss it offline.
What's up, guys? Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Let's talk turkey.
All right. So the story is, Rav Shelton, doesn't eat turkey, right? Because he believes that there's no Masorah for turkey. It's not a matter of a science versus a Masorah in that case, right? It's a matter of, does it have a Masorah? Does it not have a Masorah?
So, but turkey has, I eat turkey. Most people that I know would eat turkey.
I'm not Makabel Lashon Hara.
No,
I also eat turkey.
But some people don't have the Masorah of eating turkey. So we were able to innovate and have some progression there. So how come,
one possibility is, we made our own Masorah. That's one approach. How that happened, I don't know, but here we are. That's what other approaches are that we view a turkey as, a chicken on steroids. And we always had a Masorah for chickens, and this chicken just happened to grow a little bigger than the other boys in the class. So, that's the story with that. That's not a question of science, right? Scientifically, it should be kosher, right? It has all the simanim. It's not dores. It has the third finger, right? Right, in terms of the gizzard. Scientifically, there's no problem with it. Scientifically, it should be kosher. The question is, do we require a Masorah for it to be kosher? Or is just the simanim enough? Right. So again, if you don't require the Masorah, well, that's that. If you do require Masorah, maybe it's a faulty Masorah. They call it Tarnagol Hodu. So they asked the people in India. Maybe they thought it was under the Masorah of the chicken. Right. Maybe somehow we don't know what had happened, but now there's a Masorah because you open a turkey. It has an OU on it. Mazel tov, it's kosher. So again, yes, it deals with Masorah, but it's also not exactly the same.
I saw questions from Yona and then
Yes.
Yoni. Yona first, Yoni Herman second.
Sorry. So the question that I had as far as Sujat was beautiful. And just the question as far as the Gemara back to Baba Basra with Rabbi Bar Chana, and based on the halacha, like base Hillel, would it have mattered as far as even if they had it, because we have, aside from the exceptions in halacha where it goes like Beis Shammai because of specific situations, everything goes like Beis Hillel. So even if he had brought it back, would that have been enough to uproot Beis Hillel's hold?
It sounds like yes, doesn't it? It sounds like yes, that they would have done it. That's Rav Shafter's point. Again, we have a tradition. The Gemara says there's 6 times. And then Tosfos lists another 12 times, right? In Sukkah. So instead of 18 times, there would have been 19 times, right? There's nothing magic in the number 18. It's not we would have had to bump something off the island. So that's what I assume would have happened. Yes. Yoni?
And then you did you?
Okay. My question isn't it's not as technical as the last couple of questions, but if you were to like how can someone change Masorah? Let's say at what point can we say that we've had a Masorah, but now as a matter of fact we can change halacha?
So again, the assumption is if we have been going, we didn't know a certain fact, right? We just didn't know, and therefore we had a tradition that was one way. And all of a sudden we realized that, we got that one wrong. It happens, right? However we found it out, archaeologically we found it out, the science came out, but there's a lot of different things, right? I assume the Bnei Akiva Schools, like YU, we embrace science, right? We see it as an opportunity to understand the world better. So, as we understand the world better, right? If we have a different understanding as to what happened, okay. Again, the Torah will always be right? If there's anything that would ever go, God, that would seem to go against the Torah, it is wrong, we understand. But if there's a machlokes and this shows like one side versus the other, I think we're willing to accept it.
And not only, but do you think when Shem Mashiach comes, you think we're still going to be holding in some sort that we have?
I think that the idea, what it says that what's Eliyahu going to do when he gets here? So one thing that Eliyahu is going to do is when we say teku, that tishbi yavo kushes yitaris kush, right? Tushas kushas v'abayos. That Eliyahu is going to tell us, this is how you're supposed to paskin here, this is going to paskin there. We probably got some right and we probably got some wrong. So, at that point, we'll figure it out.
Okay, thank you.
I think you're next.
You did
Yeah, thank you. I just have a question. We were talking about if we have a halacha that conflicts with another halacha, but what if we have something that secular people are proving, are trying to show? For example, people are saying the world is a few billion years old, and the Torah is saying that it's less than 6,000.
That's an excellent case. So again, how do we deal with the issue of the age of the universe? Right. On the one hand, we have a tradition that it's 5,781 years old. They believe it's something closer to the number 15 billion. It changes from time to time. According to most opinions, 15 billion is a lot more than 5,000 and change. So what do we do about that? So there are different approaches. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was a very, very scientific fellow, was very strong in the belief of the 5781. He kind of said, you show me a 6,000-year-old man, and then we'll talk. Your carbon dating tells me this, that, I don't care. That's one approach. But I don't think I personally follow that approach. I actually think that the universe is likely 15 billion years old. I think that's true. However, just so no one should think I'm not Bikaris, how do we come to that number? Well, how do we determine a day, right? A day is based on sunrise, sunset, right? That's what it says in Fiddler on the Roof. So if that's what it's based on, sunrise, sunset, the sun wasn't created until the fourth day of creation. So what was the first day? How can you tell me it was a day if you couldn't define a day? The first day, the second day, the third day, the use of the word day cannot mean what we call a day. It's got to mean something else. It means a period, etc. But it definitely doesn't mean 24 hours. And if day 1, day 2, and day 3 didn't mean 24 hours, odds are the next 3 days also didn't mean 24 hours. Right? So therefore, when we say Rosh Hashanah is a tradition, is the beginning from what? Rosh Hashanah is the beginning from, remember, starting from day 6, from the creation of Adam Harishon. Right? Everything before that, the count began, the 5781 begins for the final day of creation. So therefore, the days beforehand, before the 5781, can't mean day, and therefore they could billions of years.
I'll also do Maror.
What's that?
I think it was just being overheard by accident.
Okay.
I have a question. So what about something like if it's, let's say, having a 2-day, let's say keeping a holiday 2 days. So let's say like Pesach. So then isn't that similar in a way of having?
Not at all, actually. People don't realize that it's not a matter that we don't know. We really are confused. We're not confused. We know exactly what day is the 14th of Nisan, and we know what day is the 15th of Nisan. People in New York know it, people in Toronto know it, people in Israel know it all the same. It's not that Israel has an inside information on us. That went out the window during the time of the Gemara. It went out of the window before they set up 2 days of Yontif. We're not having 2 days of Yontif because we're confused and now we're in Israel, we understand. No, it has nothing to do with that at all, right? What it is that we have a tradition that people who live in these communities, we've accepted upon ourselves to keep 2 days. That's our tradition. And whether we're in Israel or Canada or America or England, it makes no difference, right? This has nothing to do with science whatsoever.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
I think we're going to take one last question from the Sitniks, and then that's going to be the last question. And I'm going to thank Rabbi Rapp. I'll make a few final announcements, and we're going to let you go, everyone, at 9 o'clock. Chaim, last question.
Okay, so the tradition regarding tefillin is to use Rashi, but Chabad people still use Rabbeinu Tam tefillin because there's the machlokas of is it Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam, and how come we don't apply that logic to a lot of machlokets where we could do both sides instead of just pick one or the other?
So your question is that everybody uses Rashi, including Chabad, right?
Yes.
Chabad in the morning, they make their bracha on their Rashi tefillin.
Yeah.
Then during Chazar Hashatz, they switch and they figure let's hedge our bets a little bit. Right? Let's play it safe. The question is, why doesn't everybody try to play it safe, right? Why don't I sit at the Seder and I can eat horseradish and I can eat endives and I can eat romaine lettuce. I could just sit there. I can make everybody happy. There's nothing wrong with that, but we generally assume that when you paskin, you paskin. That's what it is. We are convinced that when we make a decision, that's the decision we follow. If someone wants to be machmir and do it, I'm not going to tell them not to, but I'll tell you, I don't wear Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. We paskin like Rashi. That's what my father did. That's what his father did. That's the tradition. So again, if certain people have a tradition to be machmir, more power to them. But I don't think we generally make people, cover all their bases. We're not so nervous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rapp. 2 quick announcements. We'll let